Well, update 2.7 Red Skies released. As expected from the dev server, it has some major unaddressed issues. I streamed playing all the new vehicles at least once, and the update really is as unfinished as it initially looked. I'll get right into it. First up, the shell camera, which could have been a major issue, but luckily got made optional. To disable it, go into the options menu, Naval, and turn off follow shell camera. Doing this re-enables input buffering, meaning that ships with a higher RPM than battleships aren't suddenly really annoying to play. As for the shell cam itself, it got a vignette effect at the borders of the screen, then a weird transparent effect that looks like a shattered pane of glass. It has a lot less visibility than the initial dev server builds, which is debatably good since it can't be used as a spotting tool as easily, but it just looks ugly. Hopefully, in the future, Gaijin can add in a different keybind for it so turning it off isn't necessary and it can be used at the player's will. One minor change is that shell tracers were made significantly more bright. They're easier to spot now, especially on smaller screens or with worse graphics settings, but are maybe a bit overtuned and too bright. But it is an improvement for spotting at the least. The next thing to cover is how the economy got massively shook up, both through the damage model changes I'll discuss later, and some odd behind the scenes changes. There was a data mine stating that most of the base numbers for earnings got halved. However, I got some confirmation from SMIN that those changes weren't actually for SL, but rather for battle activity. However, something absolutely has changed with the base modifiers. Everything seems to be earning far less now. Pair that with ships taking far longer to kill, hence less damage and kills per match, and Naval earnings are significantly slower. Naval went from an economy that was on par with the other modes to being absolutely terrible again, and overall SL earnings might be even worse than before the recent economy change. Battleships got especially damaged by this change, as they still have massive repair costs mostly, meaning that even a good match is unlikely to return the price of dying in one. A more minor change is that a lot of ships got renamed. The USS, IJN, and RN prefixes became more common for their respective trees, and lots of destroyers were renamed from the class name to the individual ship name. This one comes down to opinion. Personally, I dislike how lots of the names convey less information than before by removing the class of the vessel, but it's fine. Now for the big and controversial change, the damage models. I've had to redo this entire section multiple times since the patch released, just because Gaijin keeps fiddling with them, so hopefully this time I don't need to go re-record it in a few hours again. Every class got some kind of adjustment, and everything is much more survivable overall, but primarily destroyers and frigates. I'll be focusing on destroyers since they cost a reasonable amount to unlock, while many frigates cost as much as entry-level battleships. To clarify my position on all the damage models so you guys know where I'm coming from personally, I found 2.1 and 2.3 to be too fast and 2.5 to be just a bit too slow. Going from wanting the gameplay to slow down in 2.1 and 2.3 to the glacially slow pace in 2.7 is like going to a barbershop, asking for a trim, and getting shaved bald. Just because my hair is shorter doesn't mean it's what I asked for. Before fully getting into the destroyer side of things, I also want to say, if you've only played American destroyers in this patch, I would suggest playing a different country to make up your opinions on the new damage models. Most American destroyers have a firepower advantage so large that after this change, they're in a class of their own, and are the only destroyers that can kill other ships in a reasonable amount of time. Z-25 is also doing quite well with its powerful SAP ammunition. To get an idea of the sides that get affected by this the most, try Italy, Great Britain, or Japan. For the actual changes, destroyers take a couple times the amount of shell fire they took to kill before. This is due to each of them being changed to a more cruiser-like damage model, which sounds good in concept, but with the actual implementation, they play more like gimped cruisers than destroyers. All destroyers survive far more shell fire than before, and most segments of the ship have no effect when hit. Now, the crew is clustered into small segments, most notably the boiler room. It seems to hold up to around 30% of the ship's crew, so I guess we know what they're using for fuel. This means that most of a ship is dead space where no damage will be dealt, which makes some sense, but pair that with guns having pretty terrible dispersion and it leads to engagements feeling pretty random since the game's role deciding whether or not you actually hit your intended target. It's also far less friendly to new players, and with Naval's initial skill curve already being a common issue for new players, that's a bit of a concern for the actual growth of the mode. Currently, destroyer fights simply feel more like bumper cars than an actual video game, at least for me. Everything is super low stakes and everyone can tank crazy amounts of damage, even tiny and armored frigates, so positioning and reaction time matter a lot less. You can sit in the open getting shot by multiple enemies, tank it perfectly fine, and have time to reverse course into cover with minimal actual effects, unless someone hits a random weak point and kills half your crew immediately. Making the time to kill so long has also increased the gap between weaker and stronger ships. Previously, something like a battle class or PR-7U could kill a Fletcher in one-on-one combat by having faster reaction times or adjusting their aiming faster. Now, the vehicle with more DPS has an even greater advantage due to battles lasting so much longer. It feels like the weaker ships are doing better since they survive longer, but there's just less chance to come out on top. Destroyers are a bit better against cruisers too, though they still lose most of the time since cruisers still have superior armor and firepower. The real solution to destroyers fighting cruisers is to move the classes further apart, as this hasn't really fixed the core issue, battle rating compression. It does give Gaijin the excuse not to move them further apart though. Fire effects are also more common and more damaging, which is coming in on top of 2.5's increase to fire lethality, which I'm certain that everyone was clamoring for after the overly negative reception to that change. Flooding is how it's always been, linked to crew count, not entirely its own thing. Unless you're hit by a bomb or torpedo, flooding is almost a non-issue until you hit around 10% crew, where the game suddenly capsizes and kills you. To say that's a death by flooding and not the crew system is a stretch. The one exception to that is AI, who seem to just not do any kind of anti-flooding, though that's not really relevant to the player versus player engagements. I can see what they were trying to do, but it's executed so poorly that none of it came out right. Killing a ship by killing the crew doesn't make much sense, but they can't simply remodel the ships as if that's not the way to kill them while it still is in game. Having no kind of structural integrity system means that many ships can tank way more damage than they should. Hitting a destroyer with a 152 or 203mm HE shell do a lot more than killing a few crewmen or disabling a turret for 10 seconds, but right now there's nothing keeping track of that. The natural problem with any kind of structural integrity mechanic is that it would function almost like a health bar, but the crew percent does that anyway, and at least this one would be somewhat consistent. As for consistency, that's another huge problem. The new damage models feel really random, and it leads to battles feel more like rolling dice at each other than actually aiming, dodging, or thinking about what you're doing. It's similar to the problems with battleships when those released. Since the crew is placed into very small and specific compartments, every engagement becomes more about if dispersion RNG actually puts the shells where they need to go than any kind of actual aiming. The skill ceiling and skill floor were simply evaporated. Reaction time and positioning don't matter as much, as fights are so long that those have minimal effects on the actual outcome. Every engagement is mostly just a battle of who has what stats now. If you have more damage output, or enough survivability to impede the enemy's damage output, you win. If you don't, you lose. There's a little wiggle room, like knowing what shells to use in what situation, accurately bracketing the target sooner, or hitting turrets, but it feels more like a battle of Excel spreadsheets than a video game. The whole discussion of whether or not to balance War Thunder for realism or gameplay is its own topic, but these damage models do neither, unless the standards have gotten so low that a longer time to kill somehow results in it being more realistic. With the initial release of 2.7, the damage models were completely busted. High explosive shells did absolutely nothing to the hull, which wasn't actually Gaijin's intention. It got fixed within a few days luckily, though the actual damage models still came out as pretty busted. It's concerning how that bug got through 2 dev servers and into the live build before anyone on the dev team realized something was wrong, so I'm still going to hold that part against Gaijin. Using the dev server as a hype server instead of actually testing mechanics and problems is a bad move, and they've done it many times. As for the new ships, they're pretty repetitive. None of them actually bring much new to the table, and my first impressions in the dev server have been pretty accurate for them. USS Wyoming feels like North Dakota with an extra turret. The guns fire slower than they should, and it has no HE shell for some reason. So while it's better than North Dakota, there's just not much reason to use it over the battleships of every other country. USS Candid is pretty much a joke. 3.3 for a slow, squishy ship with the same main armament as a 1.7 makes it hilariously bad. It would be more fitting at 2.7, but putting it at the same battle rating as destroyers makes it kinda useless. VS8 shell is a gimmick and nothing more. The mines aren't really useful still, and the main armament is so poor that it loses gun duels to ships a full BR below itself. It is absolutely not worth the 1000 golden eagles. PR30 bis is just PR30, again, at a higher battle rating. There's not much to say for it. It's better than PR7U, but so was PR30 in the first place. HMS Liverpool is fine as a squad vehicle. It feels a little stronger than most 5.3s, mostly due to the armor and decent guns. It's better than Leander, and it pairs well with York. HMS Leopard is a slightly better HMS Whitby, but that's really not saying much. The 114mm is terrible with the new changes, and it still costs as much as an entry-level battleship for a vessel that still gets crushed by destroyers that you can unlock in a few hours. The only particularly good new vessel is Dante Alighieri, which seems to be one of the better battleships in the game. It's not dethroning any of the top ships like Hyuga, Maria, or Helgoland, but with its strong SAP and good armor coverage, it's around their level. It's the only battleship that can be grinded from 4.7 without RP penalties using Trento, and with Trento's massive accuracy buff in this update, I would suggest doing that before it's moved up if you want to get Dante. For the moment, with the new damage models, I'm going to avoid playing the game. The excessively long time to kill and extra randomness has taken the last part I personally found particularly fun, destroyers, and turned them into a lethargic snooze fest. Really, I'm not sure how much War Thunder I can stomach with update after update of unfinished changes and their refusal to address any actual issues, like the compression or RP economy, while they just completely change the damage models every update instead. Maybe if the person working on damage models could add STS equivalents like Duke Oil to other destroyers, America still wouldn't have the most overpowered destroyers by default. But instead, we get a back and forth pendulum of total overhauls that never quite hit the right spot. If they put out another total overhaul, like they likely will in 2.9, I'll look back into it. But at the moment, I just need a break. Playing a game that becomes unrecognizable with every update it gets is simply exhausting. As always, thank you for watching.